Lindsay, welcome to CinemaScope.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to be talking with you about J-horror and really just getting an understanding from you about this subgenre of horror, how it fits into just Japanese horror overall, how it fits into horror films, period, its influences and all of that good stuff. So, but first, as somebody who is an expert in Japanese horror and you work in Japanese horror and popular culture at Meiji University over in Japan, tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what drew you to this area of study.
Yeah, I think I was always a horror fan. I started watching horror movies when I was 11 or 12 and really got hooked. And so that was always in the background. And then I did a master's program in Japan in the early 2000s where I was focusing on Japanese literature and popular culture and media and a lot of things. And then as I moved through my graduate career and I ended up going to the University of Southern California, I ended up taking a course in just kind of a survey course of Japanese cinema that just happened to include quite a few J-horror films. And that just, it seemed really intriguing to me at that time. Not a ton of people were doing research on it or writing about it in English, at least. So I just kind of started binging a lot of films back then. Some of them weren't widely available. So I went to a lot of questionable websites and saw some questionable dubs or subtitled versions of these movies. And yeah, so then I would say pretty much since the late 2000s, that's what I've been focusing on in terms of research and just looking at, the development of the genre and specific films. And just kind of talking about that in most of my research and writing.
It's a fascinating thing to kind of get drawn into, I suppose. And I suppose being in Japan probably helps as far as your access, your interest, the number of films that you are watching and everything. I'm sure there's quite a bit of that you're also benefiting from actually living and working over there.
Definitely. And I think, these days, almost everything is accessible at some point. But there are certainly a few films that I have early access to, or sometimes that I think I would not have access to outside Japan. There will just be little random film festivals or screenings at teeny tiny little theaters in central Tokyo. And there's a wonderful theater here called Eurospace that does a lot of screenings of indie and lesser known films. And so it is great to have the opportunity to see a lot of particularly just kind of weird and unusual films before other people have access to them. And sometimes, unfortunately, they don't get a wide release. So I'm glad that I'm able to see them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's going to be the case even about some of the films that we're going to be talking about as far as like limited accessibility for even, people like when I'm wanting to talk about it on a podcast, for example, right? Let's, as we kind of get into this conversation, I want to start kind of on just a macroscopic level, just why we're talking about this. Why is J-horror an important subgenre to discuss in the realm of horror? And so I guess just, start with giving us like, what is a brief overview really of kind of the impact the J-horror has had on international cinema, international horror cinema specifically.
Yeah, I think at any given moment, the horror films of a particular country or group of countries can be said to dominate. Over the last 20 or 30 years, there have been periods when Korea was definitely at the top. There have been periods where France was at the top. And so I think, there are periods when the rest of the world kind of takes notice of another country's horror that suddenly it begins to be widespread and talked about and to have this really powerful influence. And that was definitely the case with J-horror, I would say, mostly in the late 90s and early 2000s. So, of course, J-horror had existed before then and it continues to exist now. But the kind of peak period when there was a succession of really important films and a lot of people were talking about it was really pretty short. It was basically like from around 1998 to around 2002, 2003. was this period when everybody was talking about it. That was when you had movies like Ringu, and films by Kiyoshi Kurosawa like Pulse and Cure, and also the Ju-on series and many different versions of Ju-on. And when thinking about just what is J-horror and what are its kind of distinctive features, I really like something that the professor Chika Kinoshita wrote about a few years ago, where she called J-horror not just a genre, but a discursive movement, which is kind of a fancy, just a fancy way of saying it was a bunch of people talking about stuff.
Sure.
And what you had with J-horror was you had a group of films by a small number of directors who in many cases went to the same university. A lot of them either went to or taught at Tokyo Eiga Bigakko, which is the Tokyo University of the Arts. So they were making films, they were watching each other's films, they were having these events called taidan, which is just like group interviews that will then be like written down and put into books and sold. And so they were this little club, you know, they were this kind of club of film geeks who made movies, watched each other's movies, commented on each other's movies. A lot of them had grown up being fans of like the French New Wave. And so they were these sort of geeky cinephile types. And so the result was this group of films that do have a lot of similarities in terms of their plots, in terms of their characters, in terms of their aesthetics, but that also were made by this group of people who were peers, you know, who were all working together and had a kind of similar group of influences as well.
Well, and I suppose that makes sense because I mean, there's a vibe to J-horror, like just the films have a tone, and you know, I guess that leads to my next question as far as like, what are some, and again, kind of just on a cursory level before we really start digging into it, but what are some of the key elements that you would say define J-horror, like about like what is its unique visual style, its tone?
So I think some of the key features of J-horror, the main one is just, you know, atmospheric scares over gore and jump scares. I think this is the thing that a lot of people point to when they think of the most important J-horror films, is that you're mostly getting, you know, a kind of minimalist soundtrack. And although, you know, some of the soundtracks do include a little shrieky violin every now and then, but
Right.
you know, you get sort of washed out color palettes, kind of dark lighting, and just the sense that something is lurking, the sense that something creepy is hanging around and you don't really know when it's going to show up. You also get a lot of vengeful female spirits. This is a big thing in a lot of these films. You see these, you know, sometimes children, sometimes teenage girls, sometimes adult women who are sort of these yurei, these spirits that come back to haunt the living. And I think another big thing is just sort of ambiguous endings, or endings where the monster is not necessarily defeated at the end. And, you know, that kind of leaves things open. But it's also, I think it could be seen as a little bit nihilistic. You know, these are not necessarily rah, we achieved our goal movies. And, you know, this style, these aesthetics, these characters were pretty different from the kind of horror that was popular in the US at the time. This was a period when a lot, we were still seeing a lot of slasher movies, and there were, you know, we'd had the Blair Witch Project, so there were, you know, found footage was popular in the US, but there was also a lot of, you know, the super violent graphic movies like the Hostel series and Captivity and Turistas and Saw. And so this was really different from that. And I think a lot of people gravitated toward it for that reason, because it was different from what they had been watching at the time. But at the same time, it's also very similar, and a lot of the directors have said this, that they definitely took inspiration from a lot of horror in the United States from like the 60s and 70s, like Night of the Living Dead and The Haunting of Hill House, and these movies that were also more atmospheric and creepy and less gory. So I think it was a callback to that as well.
Right. That's an interesting note. I mean, I can definitely see that. I mean, even in, I think, post 9/11 horror in the States, I definitely feel like there was that shift toward more of that torture porn type of film, a little more going for the jugular with a lot of the gore and violence that we were seeing. But even before that, I mean, yeah, you're right. We had the Scream franchise, for example. And so there's definitely a lot of that type of horror filmmaking that we had, and less of this type of cerebral horror, which we definitely see more here. So. Well, and I guess just for my last question for this part here is just like how, or like in what ways do you see that J horror is really reflective of the climate in Japan during the kind of that peak popularity period? I mean, obviously, it still is post 9/11 for everyone in the world, but I don't know how it really was affecting people over there socially, culturally. Like, what was the climate like as these films were kind of hitting this peak period?
So there's one story that gets told a lot about the rise of J-horror and the development of J-horror as a genre. And I find it really interesting. And I don't know that you can necessarily say that A caused B here, but I do think that there is a connection. And basically, in the late 1980s, I don't remember the exact date, but there was this terrible murder where this man murdered several young girls. And it was a very high profile case. It got a lot of attention. And it also got a lot of attention because this man was discovered to have a very large collection of manga and anime in his apartment. And so he became known for a while as the otaku killer. And so for a while there, people kind of associated otaku, these geeks who loved anime and manga, with murder and with violence. Yeah. And so because that story was all over the news for quite a while, and it was very upsetting in a country that is not really accustomed to, incidents of mass violence, unlike the US, where, it does happen quite frequently.
Every other day, right. Yeah.
I think there was a sort of part of this came from the television stations and the film studios themselves, basically saying, we got to be careful about the kinds of horror movies that we make. We can't really do anything that's like super violent or super gory because people don't want to see that right now because, they've got this, all of this on the news. And I think also the creators were kind of self-censoring in a way. They were just kind of like, yeah, we don't want to put out this really violent thing. So one of the results of that, and again, not necessarily a direct result of that, but around this time in the early 90s, you saw the creation of this straight-to-video and also TV series called True Scary Stories, or Scary True Stories, or Honto ni Atta Kawai Hanashi, which was created by Noroi Tsuruta. And then several of the most famous J-horror directors would work on this series. And basically, it was kind of like Unsolved Mysteries or, Rescue 911 or one of those, sort of reenactment stories that maybe we watched as kids, where basically they collected quote unquote true ghost stories that would then be reenacted, mostly with young actors. These were often stories that took place among teenagers or in a school. And it was very cheap to produce. And the aesthetic was very minimal and had this kind of found footage look to it, even though it wasn't really a found footage series. And so that series had a huge impact on J-horror as a genre. I think when you look at Ringu and Ju-on and these other films, those directors really borrowed from that aesthetic. And so I think if we're talking about the mood of Japan at the time, if we're, the late 90s, early 2000s, the 90s, we're coming off of the bubble economy. So the 1980s was this period of huge speculation and growth in Japan. And then the bubble burst in the early 90s, and you had the whole, what they call the lost generation, which is a group of people who, they might have been let go from their jobs. They were adrift and, feeling really uncertain. And children who grew up in this time, I think, tended to be really risk averse, because they had seen how everything had fallen apart. So there was definitely, I think, a sense of loss and uncertainty. And so I feel like you can, to a certain extent, see that reflected in some of these films because they do touch on, the struggles of single parenthood and urban isolation and just uncertainty about the future where, 20 or 30 years before, your future might have been very clearly mapped out for you. Now you suddenly had people who really didn't know what they were going to do or what path they should take. So I think you can definitely see that reflected in a lot of the films.
Interesting. And I suppose, I mean, you brought up kind of that low budget horror show element of it. And there was also like kind of the V cinema, I think is what they call it. Like kind of from reading about it, it sounded like the horror industry in Japan was not, there wasn't a lot of money in it at the time. And so a lot of what was being made horror wise was this straight to video, really cheap sort of horror. And I mean, even like the first few Ju-on films like fit right into that mold.
Exactly. And a lot of famous J-horror directors got their start in V cinema, which, was just the Japanese film industry is very hierarchical. And basically, if you want to be a director or a producer, you have to start at the bottom, and you often have to slave away for years doing grunt work before you will ever get a chance to even assistant direct a film. And so V cinema was a way of bypassing that, because if you worked in V cinema, you could very quickly get a chance to direct a film, because these films had to be shot quickly and cheaply, and they needed to make a lot of them. And so one of my favorite stories is about how Kiyoshi Kurosawa began his career in V cinema and in pink cinema, actually, which is like softcore porn. Yeah. And so he was hired to direct a softcore porn film, but then was fired because he didn't put any sex in the film. Because basically he wasn't interested in filming sex. He wanted to make, an interesting artistic film. And so he lost his job for that reason. Or the fact that Hideo Nakata, the director of Ring, what he really wanted to do, he didn't like horror movies. What he really wanted to do was make a documentary about Joseph Losey, this sort of little known artistic director. And he really wanted to make this documentary, but his studio basically said, "Look, we really need you to make a horror film. Like we need you to make something that makes money." And so basically, he made Ring to finance his Joseph Losey documentary, because he knew that they would pay him to make that documentary.
And did he get his documentary made?
I don't think he ever actually got it made. I don't think he might have filmed some footage for it, but I don't think it was ever released. I can't remember. But funny. Yeah, I thought that was funny.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about kind of like the rise of J-horror in the 90s. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there was this point where, it had been around before all of this, right? And so, I mean, we're at this point where it's emerging here, and we have films like Ringu, or you say it much better than I do, but I say it the American Ringu, or Ju-on the Grudge, which is technically the third of the Ju-on franchise. How was it that these films kind of like kickstarted this boom that we started seeing in the late 90s, early 2000s? Like, what happened?
Yeah, I think it was just a really wonderful bit of timing. And, who knows why one particular film above others breaks through and has mass appeal where others don't. And I really think, it's always just a confluence of different factors. And it's impossible to say like why this film and not this film. But
if we could figure that out, we'd be billionaires.
Then we could make a fortune as producers. I think, and I've actually just recently learned, this is kind of interesting. I, for many years, had been saying, the Japanese title of the Japanese film is Ringu, or The Ring in English. But actually, I learned that when people talk about the Japanese film, they say Ring. And when they talk about the US remake, they say The Ring. So I've been doing it wrong.
That's how I do it. Yeah,
yeah, sure. So anyway, I do think that internationally, at least, Ring was the first J-horror to really get a lot of international attention. It was also maybe the first one, to get a very high-profile U.S. remake. And I think it was this wonderful combination of the content of the film itself and the way it was spread and shared and distributed. Because you have this movie that is about a VHS cassette that needs to be copied to share this curse that is embedded in it. And you also have a situation where people are sharing this movie in that same way, where they are, dubbing it and kind of making bad copies of it and sharing them with each other, sharing this physical media, which is a thing we used to do. And also, so then you had the very savvy marketing team, the people who marketed these films outside Japan, who would do things like, leave an unmarked video cassette on a park bench. And then somebody would take it home and open it up, and it would have this very creepy imagery on it and some text promoting the release of the film. And so I think that combination of, the film itself and the marketing really helped it. And also, this was a time when the marketing of these films was very much tied to the idea that they were from exotic Japan. And, you had one of the distributors was actually called Tartan Asia Extreme. So Asia Extreme, this idea that, and I really think
that logo.
A lot of the messaging was just, you think you've seen fucked up horror, you haven't seen Asia. It's like, because it's from Asia, because it's from Japan, well, they're lawless and they don't have the same rules. And this is a very old tactic, this kind of Orientalist idea of the exotic other. And so everything that comes from there must be really depraved and really freaky. And it worked. I think a lot of people did sort of latch onto that. And that tactic has been used for Korea as well, for Thailand, for like a lot of Thai martial arts films like Ong Bak were marketed with the idea that, in Thailand, they don't have unions and they don't have safety protocols. So all of those actors did their own stunts and they all ended up in the hospital. So that was the kind of marketing that you saw with these films. And I think with Ring, at least, it was incredibly successful. And actually, Ring to this day is, as far as I know, the only J-horror film that in Japan, at least, has been very financially successful. The other films have not been, just because horror is not traditionally a super successful genre in Japan. It's not family friendly. It's not something that, everybody goes to see. So while other J-horror films, they haven't necessarily been failures, but they haven't been huge financial successes. But Ring was a big success both in Japan and abroad.
Is that not the case of Ju-on the Grudge? Because I thought that was another one, but I'm wrong.
That one did all right. I think it wasn't as successful as Ring, but certainly, and I mean, Ju-on is a much, Ring is a franchise as well. It has tons of sequels and offshoots.
And a crossover between the two.
Exactly, yeah. Ju-on even more so. I think maybe the difference is that, if I remember correctly, both Ring, the Japanese film, and The Ring, the US remake, were pretty big, tentpole films. These were, Gore Verbinski directed the US Ring, and they were both, pretty financially successful. Whereas the US remake of The Grudge did not do very well, I don't think.
It did better than most of the other. I mean, those two are probably the only Japanese J-horror remakes over here that are worth looking at.
Yeah, they're the only ones that did pretty well. So anyway, I think it's the other movies certainly were not failures. They just weren't big box office successes. Whereas Ring, and I think the other thing about Ring is just its staying power and its sort of iconography, where even if you don't watch horror films, even if you don't know anything about Japan or Japanese horror, you've probably heard of Sadako. You probably recognize that image of the girl in the white dress with the black hair over her face. So it's pretty well known at this point.
Right. Crawling out of the TV. Right. It's one of those kind of like images that burns into your head. So
yeah.
As far as like, we already talked a little bit about kind of like the climate in Japan at this particular point in time, but as far as like contextually with everything, with where Japan was at the time, how did that affect or trigger the filmmakers to focus on particular themes, narratives, different things that became kind of a key part in what we ended up kind of expecting to see in these J-horror films.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like the choices of stories and themes and characters, first of all, some of these movies were based on popular novels, like Ring was based,
right.
both Ring and Dark Water were based on a novel and a short story by Koji Suzuki. And a lot of these directors have talked about how when it came to the screenwriters as well, when it came to their stories and their themes and their characters, they were drawing from so many different places. If it wasn't the novels, they were thinking about Japanese folklore. So you have these vengeful spirit characters that exist in Japanese art, in Japanese sort of folk tales and things like that. But also, again, they were drawing from foreign films as well. So they were looking at, like 1960s and 1970s domestic dramas and stories where often the family and the home is the site of the disturbance. And so I think when we look at the release of these films and how they're remembered now, sometimes, the climate of the time is affected people's perception of the movies. But I don't know if it was necessary that if necessarily the truth that, say, in Japan in 1998, you had this sense of, social isolation, urban isolation, therefore, Hideo Nakata made this movie about a single mother or something.
Gotcha.
But I do think that the reception of those movies and their treatment of things like single parenthood or lonely death, which is a big topic in Japan these days, of elderly people dying alone or living alone and not being cared for. I think people responded to them in a certain way because those issues were front and center at the time in Japan. And I should say that, those types of topics have always been, I think, a big part of horror films around the world. Horror films are, they're stories of ghosts, they're stories of monsters, but they're also very often stories of the mundane, stories of just people being bullied and someone's father dying and a divorce and, these sort of mundane difficulties that we have to deal with that are juxtaposed with these super scary ghosty things. And I think the messaging is often that, the really scary thing is life in the ordinary world. The ghosts are not as bad as having to deal with, a divorce or the death of a family member or something like that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you're right. That's very, very much what you see in just horror in general. Like that's a key part of it. But something that we do see more in the J-horror, I mean, we see it everywhere, but J-horror also seems to really tap into some technological fears that I think is a pretty interesting element that we find. And I mean, likewise, like urban legends, elements like that. But the technological element I find very fascinating in the way that it integrates into kind of the foundation of the stories and using that for its themes, like what we see in Pulse, or I mean, even going back to Ringu with the videotape, like that type of technology is somehow now an integral part of the actual curse, right?
Absolutely. And I think, horror has always played with our fears of technology and, whatever those fears might have been. And I think that technology itself has always kind of been connected to the ghostly. Like if you go back 100 years and you look at, the telegraph and the telephone, the fact that people were conducting seances and seeing their seance activity is very similar to the act of sending a message via telegraph, this idea of things floating through the ether and making contact with people. And for me, growing up watching movies like Poltergeist, I always have a vivid memory of the final scene in that film where, they've escaped their horrible house and they've gone to a hotel and the father just takes the television and shoves it out the door. And I think the messaging just couldn't be any clearer. It's like, your television is evil and it will haunt you. So, we have these movies that start with, with record players, with telegraphs, with televisions, with VCRs, with VHS cassettes. And I think that so many movies have touched on the idea that these objects, these media objects, these objects of media technology can be gateways to the ghostly. You know, if you watch them too much, if you turn them on, you let the ghosts in and you let evil into your home. And in certain movies, there's certainly a bit of moralizing with this too, where, you know, you get the sense that like you're a bad parent because you let your kids watch too much TV or something, and therefore now the ghosts are coming for them. And I think Japanese horror has long been focused on a lot of different, particularly communication technology, cell phones and the internet. And it's been really fascinating to see how, as the technology has developed, so the films have also shifted their focus. So you have a movie like Ring, where the focus is on a haunted VHS cassette and VCR. And then if you look at the sequels and offshoots of Ring, what you see is it kind of gradually shifts to the internet being haunted and YouTube being haunted and smartphones being haunted and Sadako spreading her curse through social media and through all these new technologies. And I think that you can see that in horror films from other countries as well, how whenever there's a new type of technology, and of course, if there's new technology, there will be hand-wringing around that technology, and horror will quickly zone in on that make something scary about it.
Well, and yeah, that's just the nature of sequels also, right? You're always like, how can we one up what we did before? What's new and different, because you don't want to ever repeat yourself. You're always looking for, we want to give people what we had been doing, but then throw something new into that. And when it's technology focused, it makes sense that they're always looking at the new technologies and everything.
Yeah.
Let's kind of keep talking about, we've been talking about kind of the technology, but I want to talk more about some of the key characteristics, the themes, those sorts of elements that go along with J-horror, and a little more deeply. You mentioned vengeful ghosts, and I just want to kind of like vengeful ghosts, maybe also like cursed objects. What are some, or what role does that play in the world of J-horror as far as like, why is that an important element? You know, does it tap into an element of Japanese ghost stories in general? The kaidan, is that a part of it?
Yeah, I think that the vengeful spirit, particularly the female vengeful spirit, is a staple of a lot of Japanese ghost stories and folk tales and novels. One of the earliest examples is from the 11th century novel, The Tale of Genji, where you have this, basically it's a story about a Japanese prince who has many, many lovers and many, escapades and affairs. And in particular, there is this one woman who he loves and leaves, Lady Rokujo, who then comes back as a vengeful spirit to haunt him and his new lovers. And I think that version of the story of this, just a wronged woman, basically, a woman who was wronged in life, who then comes back to haunt the living. And I think an important feature of a lot of the vengeful spirits in Japanese horror is that they're not just after the people who wronged them. So it's not that they just come back to haunt the person who killed them or who raped them or who hurt them in some way. It's just anyone. It's anyone who happens to step into the house where they once lived or touch the object that they once owned. So I think this idea of this sort of chaotic rage that is just flung in all directions, and if you're unlucky, you get hit with it. So it's, there's not a particular target. And another really famous example of this, a story that's been told many times and that was definitely a big inspiration for Ring, is Yotsuya Kaidan, which is the ghost story of Yotsuya, which is a story that was first performed as a kabuki play around I think it was 1835. And it has since been performed many times as a kabuki play. It has been made for TV and film, I think 30 times. Oof, wow. And there are many different versions of it. And this semester, semester in one of my classes, I taught a version that is just about to be released by Radiance Films, and which is called The Tale of Oiwa's Ghost. So it's Yotsuya Kaidan basically, but it just has a slightly different title. And basically, the ghost story of Yotsuya is a story of a woman during the Edo period who is married to a scoundrel, and they have a child, and the scoundrel gets the attention of a much prettier younger woman. And so that prettier younger woman's family decides to poison Oiwa, the wife, so that she will, be dead, and then the scoundrel can marry the younger, prettier woman. And they do that, and it's very complicated. A lot of things happen, but basically, this poor woman, her face is horribly scarred and disfigured. So, like, one half of her face is completely covered by scar. She dies. She comes back as a vengeful spirit, and in particular, in the kabuki versions of the show, her face is painted on this lantern that kind of hovers above the stage. And so, a lot of people have talked about that as an inspiration for Ring, with Sadako and her scary eye and her black hair hanging in her face. And so these female vengeful spirits, and I think it's very important that they're women. And my students really cottoned on to this quickly when I asked them about this. And they basically said, well, women had no power at this time, and becoming vengeful spirits was a way of taking back power. It was the only way that they could be powerful. And also the idea of a woman being scarred physically, being such a terrible thing, because, her face was her only form of social capital. And so then she was, scarred, and basically all her power was taken away from her. So then coming back as a vengeful spirit is a way of kind of reclaiming her power and taking back something that was taken from her. And I think just in so many of these stories, these women, when they were alive, were treated so horribly in so many ways. They were they were physically abused, they were raped, they were murdered, they were just in terrible, terrible conditions. So their rage is deep and justified. And I think it's a lot these days. A lot of people watching these movies have a kind of good for her moment when they see these vengeful spirits doing their work.
Yeah, it's interesting because, so often I think when you see ghost stories told, like Western sorts of ghost stories, there is a sense of, awful stuff happening because of a ghost. And our protagonist is tormented for a while and then realizes what's going on and has to figure out, like, is there an object or a thing that I have to do, or an element that has to get returned, or something that has to be said to a particular person, whatever the case may be. Once that's done, it's like the spirit is freed, and you have that moment where it's like, and everything is light again, and our protagonist has saved the day. And I think that often these types of ghosts are, I'd say generally it's a woman or a child that seem to be the two cases that we largely get. But then it's resolved, right? And that seems to be the Western way to handle this sort of ghost story. I don't know if I can think of many Western stories that are this type of a horror film where the vengeance just continues.
Yeah, and I think that that is definitely the case in a lot of Japanese stories where it isn't so neatly resolved, and I think that does reflect a thinking from several different places. You could say that it is exists in Buddhism, it exists in Shintoism, it just exists as a cultural reality in different aspects of Japanese culture, that things are not so neat and clean, and that when someone is wronged and they're rageful, that rage is not always so easily appeased, and you can't necessarily fix things cleanly. And I do think that, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, and maybe even before that, we are starting to see more of that in English language horror films. We're starting to see a little more postmodern kind of nihilism in some of these films, where they are also choosing to have these sort of bleaker, but at least more open-ended endings. Like I think The Babadook was one of my favorite examples, where you have this monster that invades the home that is threatening both this mother and this child, and the film essentially ends with the knowledge that the mother and the child will have to live with the monster. It doesn't destroy them, but they don't defeat it. But they just have to live with it. And so I think I'm starting to see that a little more in some English language horror films as well, where it's like we're not going to vanquish the monster all the time. And it's
Yeah,
not necessarily going to be appeased. And, I think we could say maybe that J-horror was part of the influence of that. I think just worldwide, that's been a trend in a lot of countries where you're starting to see a little more darkness and a little more chaos and uncertainty in a lot of your endings.
And I suppose I would argue that what we're talking about is probably different than, starting with films like going back to Carrie, Brian De Palma's film, that has like a denouement where everything feels peaceful, but then suddenly Carrie's hand pops out of the ground and grabs her friend. And in the realm of films or franchises, you would often have kind of that last little surprise ending where the villain would pop up one last time, like Freddy Krueger or whoever the case may be. So I suppose there is that we do see, but I don't know. I guess I feel that that's different. It feels like a last little like scare that they're just throwing in. I guess I never really read that quite the same way that I read something like whatever happened to the ghost in the house in Ju-on and how she's just never going to let it go. Right. It feels very different.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that if you look at like, the Nightmare on Elm Street series and Friday the 13th and all of these movies, that sort of denouement at the end really seems to be more about setting up the sequel. Whereas I think the real ending of the film is like, okay, we're done. Even though you're kind of not done. Whereas, in movies like The Grudge, it is more purposefully ambiguous and very open about the fact that we did not defeat this monster, and she's going to stick around.
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of like the psychological terror and kind of that creeping dread that we get in these films, more so than the straight up like slasher sorts of things. Just like revisiting a film like Pulse, for example, it's definitely one that you feel is just like this slow build in just discomfort over the course of it, as you don't really know what's going on, but it just feels very intensely creepy. And that's a key element of what we have come to expect in J-horror films.
Yeah, I think psychological dread, psychological creepiness, just the sense that something is wrong, you don't really know what it is a big part of these films. And there was a documentary recently that I was lucky enough to participate in called The J-Horror Virus, and it had some really wonderful interviews with some key figures from J-Horror. And the director, Teruyoshi Ishii, said something really fascinating that I can't stop thinking about, which I think, and I think his view is shared by quite a few people. Basically, he said that for a Japanese audience, if a monster, whether it's a ghost or a werewolf or whatever, if a monster physically attacks their victims, then that movie is not a horror movie anymore. It's a monster movie or an action movie. A horror movie is where the monster psychologically attacks the victims for a Japanese audience. And, some people might disagree with this, and it might be a somewhat essentialist way of thinking, but it really stuck with me because when you look at so much key J-horror, I do think that this is true, where the spirits, the ghosts, the monsters, they don't stab people, they don't strangle them, they just stare at them, or they linger in their space and terrify them to death in some cases. Definitely with Ring, I think what we see is that people are just so horrified by what they see that they, are driven mad or die because of it. And so I think that's a really powerful form of terror, particularly for an audience as well, because I think, if you're an audience watching a horror film, obviously it's terrifying to see someone get physically attacked or stabbed. But when it's psychological, I think you as an audience member can really relate to that. You can really immerse yourself in it, because often the movies make you feel like you're going mad as well, because you just don't know what's going on, and you kind of feel like you're going crazy. I think Kiyoshi Kurosawa in particular is really good at this, where he will just set up little things that will happen, and people will say little things that don't really make much sense, and you'll kind of be like, wait, where am I? What's going on? And so it's just I know that for me, one of my favorite just genres or subgenres of film is, is the ghost real or is it all in my head?
Sure,
And,
yeah.
you can have endless fun with that situation where, the character constantly has to ask themselves, am I losing my mind? Or is there something really bad happening? And often, the people around them, some of them believe them, and a lot of them think they need to be put into an institution, and that can be really scary. And so, Japanese horror films are really good at playing on that, I think.
Yeah, no, they really are. Going back to like we talked about technology, but what about like just kind of modern anxiety and how much like the modern society in Japan? And you mentioned loneliness earlier, as far as kind of like this epidemic for older people who are feeling lonely and are afraid of dying alone. And there are just other elements like that seem to be very Japanese that we end up seeing in some of these. In addition to like the kind of like I'm thinking of films like Suicide Club or something, where it's just like the nature of suicide.
Yeah, I think that.
Actually, I'm going to have you pause real quick. I just have to let my cat out. She's decided she needs out. So this one.
Sure.
Thank goodness, girl. Come on. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Like she's going to be, I've no one here. She's going to meow for an hour or so.
Sure. So yeah, I think that, when we talk about horror films and the depiction of like loneliness, anxiety, social isolation, this isn't something that is unique to Japan. This is something that a lot of horror movies touch on. But I do think that, particularly if you look at movies like Pulse and The Grudge and Cure as well, what you see in a lot of those films is a sense of disconnection. And what you have is people who do not have the same networks that they used to rely on. Maybe they're married, maybe they have kids or parents, and yet there is this sense that they cannot rely on other people to the extent that they would like to. And there's also this sense that I think has been around for a while, but I've definitely been hearing it more and more in the last 10 years in Japan. Something that people say repeatedly, which is the word mendokusai basically means it's a bother or it's a problem. And when people talk about just human relationships, having friends, having a partner, having sisters and brothers, they often kind of shake their heads and say, oh, mendokusai. I mean, it's just, it's a bother. And so there is this feeling, particularly among young people, but, not just them, that it's just too much of a pain to maintain human relationships. And I will say that in certain contexts in Japan, it is frustrating because there are a lot of rules and there are a lot of hierarchies and there are a lot of, things about the way you have to speak and the way you have to conduct yourself that are really frustrating. And so I do understand how people in certain contexts be like, yeah, I don't think I'd want to maintain those kinds of relationships either. It's a pain. But because of that, I think you are seeing there are a lot of people who are choosing to be alone more or to have just very superficial relationships. And so they say that it's their choice and they say that it's what they want. But the result is also that they feel very lonely. Very uncertain and very unsupported. And so I think we can see that as well in some of these films like Pulse and Cure and Ju-on, where you have an elderly person who is living in a situation where she is cared for by her family, but she's kind of a burden. She doesn't. They don't really want to care for her, which that is definitely a reality for a lot of people in Japan who have to care for their elderly relatives. You have these young people in Pulse who are mostly living alone in these tiny apartments in Tokyo. And I think Pulse is a really fascinating example to me because there are so many moments in that film where people just say really weird things, where, somebody, one of their friends just kind of disappears And another person they're working with says, I think it's just better if you don't care about other people.
Right.
And then another young woman after this guy has died is just kind of like, let's just pretend everything is normal.
Yeah. Right.
And it's just so odd, and just the way that these people talk to each other. And then in Cure as well, you have this police detective who has a wife with mental health problems, and he doesn't know how to take care of her. And, I think feels a real lack of support in terms of how to deal with that. So yeah, you're seeing, in addition to, the ghosts and the supernatural things these characters are dealing with, they're also just really unmoored. They're really kind of off balance and uncertain and just kind of scared of everyday life. And they're anxious about a lot of things that are not ghostly at all.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at that. It's also interesting how that really kind of ties into kind of the nature of technologies as well, especially as technology has grown and theoretically making us that much easier to connect with each other and everything. But at the same time, it's keeping us farther apart from each other, right? And so there's a layer of that in all of everything you just said with how technology kind of fits within that. And I think that's a fascinating layer that you have in these films.
For sure. And I think, it's a bit heavy handed, but the moment in Pulse where we have this young computer science grad student who shows us this program that someone else designed with just a group of dots on a screen. And she says, they move independently, but if they get too close to each other, they die.
Yeah.
and she says, and then she follows that by saying, yeah, well, people don't really connect. We all live separately.
Yeah, right.
Just, this very kind of bleak view of the world. But I think there's another really lovely film that I only saw recently, actually, for the first time by Kurosawa, called Seance, which I feel like the big focus of that film is just that the wife character is just really bored. And she's fed up with this sort of everydayness of her life. And so she essentially orchestrates the arrest of her husband for something he didn't do, just because she's bored and she wants to mix things up a little bit. And
is that one way to do it?
Yeah, in another Kurosawa film, Creepy, I feel like kind of something similar happens where this family gets pulled into this sort of psychotic person's games, and you get the sense that some of these people are doing it just because they're bored and they want their lives to be more interesting.
Yeah, right. That's fascinating. That's wild. The last question I have for you, as it relates to kind of like all these different characteristics and everything, is the role of urban legends and modern mythology as well. I'm thinking of like something like the more recent trilogy of I'm forgetting his name right now. It's it's
the Scary Village trilogy, or
Scary Village trilogy, right? Yeah,
mm-hmm.
Like the one about I just watched it. I'm totally blanking its name. Like the Suicide Forest
Village,
for example. Mm-hmm. Like we're seeing things like that. That my understanding is that the process of Shimizu adapting those stories was looking at some fairly recent urban legends and kind of the mythologies that had arisen around particular villages and stuff. So, I mean, that seems like another element that is being drawn on for these stories.
For sure. And I think these recent films, including the Scary Village trilogy, are really fascinating because there's a group of films that have been released over the last 15 years or so, a lot of them straight to video, that have definitely drawn on internet urban legends. And in particular, they have taken a lot from Nichanneru, or 2chan, which is the kind of precursor to 4chan, this massive, online bulletin board where people just post threads and comments, and that is kind of a hotbed of right-wing hate speech and completely unmoderated, but at one time was a really powerful force in Japanese media, maybe not so much today. But there are several threads or several sections of 2chan where people post ghost stories and this really happened to me type stories.
Sure.
And so a lot of there's a whole series called Ni Channel no Noroi, which is Curse of 2chan, which is just a sort of omnibus collection of stories from 2chan. And so you have that, and then you have the Scary Village trilogy. You have another recent movie called Kisaragi Station, which is also taken from a 2chan story where someone supposedly posted, I just woke up and I don't know where I am. I'm in a station that I've never seen before, kind of thing. And so a lot of these are kind of similar to like Reddit no sleep threads or creepypasta and stuff like that. But what's really interesting is the movies that are based on these urban legends often take them and run with them, where what you see in the movie does not really resemble the original urban legend. So I think, for example, the Suicide Forest Village story, the movie, it's kind of a weird hodgepodge of a lot of different stories that take on a very different flavor. So Aokigahara, the forest at the base of Mount Fuji, is often called the Suicide Forest, no village, right. Only because it is unfortunately a place where people go to take their lives. And a lot has been written about that. But the movie sort of mixes that reality with this idea that there is a strange village of people living in the middle of Aokigahara who are cursed in some way and who I think are maybe cannibals. I'm not quite sure. So, and
not
there's
exactly
also
clear,
yeah, and then there's also talk about a kotori bako, which is a kind of cursed box. And so, it's just kind of mixing all of these things together. And that leads me to the fact that so many contemporary J-horror films also love to invent urban legends. So they are often movies about urban legends that are not actually urban legends. They were invented for the film, like Koji Shiraishi's Noroi, The Curse, is a great example of this, where he invents whole cloth this urban legend of so-called Kagutaba, who is a demon, and is connected to kind of twisty, coily things and sort of Cthulhu-like imagery and stuff like that. So it's really fascinating to see the kind of threads that connect all of these stories, where you have internet forums, you have movies, you have folklore, and sometimes you just have complete inventions, that never existed as urban legends in their own right. But that feeling that, ooh, this is something I heard from a friend of a friend. It works like a charm in horror, because, it's like, oh yeah, this could be true. This could be something that really happened. So I think it really appeals to a lot of people.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And we'll certainly see that in some of the films that we're going to be discussing. Speaking of, let's start jumping into some of these films. Let's start our conversation with Ringu, or Ring, however you want to say it, or however you say it, Ringu. It's very, very nice. Hideo Nakata's film from 1998. This film revolutionized the J-horror genre and sparked a global interest in Japanese horror cinema, as we've been discussing. The story follows journalist Riko Asakawa as she investigates a cursed videotape that's rumored to kill viewers 7 days after watching it. As Riko races against time to unravel the mystery behind the tape and its creator, she uncovers a dark history of violence and supernatural revenge. With its haunting visuals, unsettling atmosphere, and iconic antagonist Sadako, Ringu introduced a new style of psychological horror that would influence countless films worldwide. The film also explored themes of technological anxiety, single motherhood, and the consequences of uncovering buried secrets, reflecting the social concerns of late 90s Japan. So let's talk about how this film kind of took what had been laid in the realm of J-horror up to this point, and kind of built upon that, kind of creating this new foundation for what would really kind of become the J-horror boom in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, I think one really fascinating thing about Ring is that it's not a found footage horror film, and yet it takes so much from that genre. It is about a piece of found footage in a sense.
True.
It's about this found video
point.
cassette, and it very much borrows the aesthetic of a lot of found footage horror and a lot of the series like Scary True Stories, and just the fact that it is centered on high school girls, that it opens with these two high school students, giggling and sharing this scary story. So that was really interesting as well. And it definitely, the movie was in Japan marketed to high school girls and was popular with high school girls. And so that was kind of unusual. I think, there's this perception that, or there was this perception for a long time that horror was for boys, and it never really has been. Women have always been horror fans. They've always been a big part of horror audiences.
Absolutely,
but I think particularly in the US and in other countries as well, there was this perception for a long time that scary movies were a thing for boys, but actually they're very popular with teenagers, with couples, with
across
groups
the board,
of girls.
right?
Yeah. And so, so the fact that this movie featured high school girls was interesting. I think, older Japanese horror films tended to focus on adults, or maybe small children, but not so much teenagers. So that was really interesting. And I think that the film is just, it's such a collection of tropes and ideas that had, existed in Japan for a long time, but that just really came to fruition in a beautiful way in this film, with just this really fascinating story, again, based on this novel by Koji Suzuki, and just this idea of this virus that spreads through a VHS cassette. So on the one hand, you have something very ancient, very old, this story of this psychic woman and her daughter. And then you have, at the time, something very modern of this, VHS cassette and things being spread by copying and stuff like that.
Well, so it's fun because we see the video, and this holds true for a number of our films, including like Pulse, where you're getting footage that people are watching, but then you have the question, well, who's actually filming this? Is this like a ghost vision sort of footage that I'm looking at? Like that becomes a part of it that I think taps into the nature of like, how did this actually get recorded?
Yeah, and the ghost POV is a big question in a lot of these films, because that is what we're seeing, I think, is we're seeing a ghost POV. And we see that as well in another film that I think you're going to talk about at a later point, Jagande, or Psychic Vision, has a long scene where the camera is like floating up above and looking down, and we realize that we, the audience, are looking at a ghost, or looking at a ghost POV. And so, so the video in Ring is really fascinating, and I think brings up a question that everybody asks with any kind of found footage horror, which is who was filming this and why? And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it was the military, sometimes it was the mother or something, but sometimes it's like, how did you get this footage? And where did this come from? And so with Ring, you have the idea that this is a psychic imprint, that this video cassette is the physical embodiment of this child's rage and memories, and just, piecemeal, just fragments of things that she saw and felt that we see in that video.
And we're not having the need, which sometimes becomes the fault in Western remakes or just Western horror films, period, of the explanatory, expository, this is how that actually happened. This is how the psychic rage of this child got imbued onto a videotape. Like we don't need that. It's just a thing.
Exactly. And I think this is one thing that I really love about a lot of early J horror is there's not too much explaining. You're kind of left to fend for yourself. And unfortunately, in a lot of more recent J-horror, I feel like it often buckles under the weight of its own explanation. There's often these long monologues of, explaining this history where I just immediately tune out and say, no, we don't need this.
Right.
But Ring is very good in that sense that we do, of course, eventually learn the history of Sadako and her mother and everything like that. But we don't get a lot of explanations of how exactly the videotape was made or how exactly the curse works and things like that.
No, right. Exactly. Of the films, this actually feels, I suppose you could say, a little more kind of a straightforward, like horror journey for our character. Like there's something that's happening. She sets out, the quest to go figure it out, and she goes and tries to solve the puzzle and get to the bottom of this, learning about Sadako and everything. So in some ways, I can see some of the Western kind of storytelling structure as far as the way that the horror is built, but at the same time, it also feels like it just kind of like is always finding ways to subvert that a little bit, right? Like with the evolution of the story that we get as it comes like toward the end and everything, as we talked about earlier, like she's just not going to stop. It's just going to keep going.
Yeah, and I think it does have, a kind of typical 3-act structure, and it is kind of a quest and a solving a mystery, and I think, the way that it subverts a lot of that is, of course, with the ending where you think the mystery's been solved and the monster has been defeated because, we find Sadako's body in the well, we take it out of the well. But then, we have that famous final scene with the professor in his room. And when she comes out of the television set, and then even after that, when Reiko finds out that the only way to stop this is to make a copy.
Yeah.
And it kind of has multiple endings, which is a lot of fun. But I think it is, I would say, compared to some other J-horror, it is a little more just straightforward narrative-wise, where you have the inciting incident, you have the search for the truth, and then you have, we think we found the truth, but oops, no, we didn't. There's more.
Yeah.
But then we do have a clear ending where even if, the monster has not been defeated, they have at least discovered, they think, they have discovered how to keep it at bay, so to speak.
Right. And it's interesting to look at film, like a specific film like It Follows, and to recognize the threads that they pulled from this very film to say, okay, what if we do that, but it's all about sex, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This also, I mentioned earlier, like we're looking at divorce and single parenthood. As far as like how that plays in Japanese society and how it fits into the film, is it offering us any insights as far as looking at that?
So one really interesting detail about that is in the original novel, it's a single father. And then
an interesting change.
Yeah. The change to single mother actually has some sort of unfortunate commentary associated with it, where if I remember correctly, it was either the novelist or the director who basically said, women are just more connected to spirits. So it feels more meaningful to see them be scared on film. And it was just, wasn't really helpful. But I do think, though, that I agree in the sense that historically, when you've seen people being scared and freaking out in horror films, it has usually been women, and women are often depicted as more vulnerable on screen. So it makes sense to have the woman be at the center of it. But at the same time, we have seen a lot more horror films lately that have male protagonists who are being just as scared as the women have been. But I think that the depiction, the choice to make Reiko specifically a single mother is really interesting. And also to not only make her a single mother, but to show that she still has a relationship with her ex-husband. Because I feel like in Japan, typically, first of all, if people are married and they have a child and they divorce, that child often remains with one parent and has no contact with the other parent. And this
Really?
is seen as healthy. It's seen as the best way to do things, and I think there's plenty of research that shows that it's not.
Yeah.
But within Japan, joint custody is not a thing. It is quite common, and of course, I mean, privately, plenty of parents might make the decision to have for the child to have a relationship with both parents. But it is very common for the child to only live with one parent and to have no contact with the other side of the family. So just to depict this single mother who has a relationship with her ex-husband, but the ex-husband doesn't really have a relationship with the child is kind of interesting. And just some little throwaway lines in there where, at one point the ex-husband says, is the boy okay? And she just says, oh, he's used to it. Just like he's used to being alone.
Yeah.
And so that was really fascinating because I feel like, of course, as in anywhere, but particularly in East Asia, mothers are under so much pressure in Japan to be, the perfect mother and to only be a mother, to be, completely devoted to your child and to nothing else. The child always has to come first. And so to depict this woman who is very much her own person, she has her own identity, she has a job, and she's not really a great mother, actually. She doesn't really seem to be, and that's fine. It's like I'm interested in seeing portrayals of mothers who are not necessarily great mothers and who aren't saints. So yeah, that just in that context, knowing that this movie is taking place in a country where, there's so much pressure to be a good mother and where, single mothers are not looked kindly upon. You're supposed to stay married at all costs for the benefit of the child. To see this portrayal of a single mother, who isn't really very focused on being a mother, who's much more focused on her job. I'm sure it hit interestingly in 1998 in particular. And it still hits interesting today, I think.
Well, and it's just interesting, like Nakata also explores a relationship between the parents in Dark Water, where it's a little different because the father's views of how the mother's doing things, but still there's definitely an interesting continuing exploration that Nakata is doing with that type of parental relationship where the parents are both still kind of there.
Absolutely. And I think in even more so in Dark Water, we get this very, really nuanced and conflicted portrayal of motherhood where you have this woman who is really trying so hard to be a good mother, but she is under so much pressure from so many different forces, not only the ghosts, but the fact that her husband is trying to sue for custody for her child and just trying to get a job, so she can pay the rent and keep her child clothed and fed, and also her own lingering trauma, because we get the sense that she was abandoned and neglected by her own mother. And so she's desperate to not repeat the cycle. And that movie really has a kind of weird ending, I think, in that on the one hand, we see that mother kind of make the ultimate sacrifice, as a lot of mothers in Japanese stories have done throughout the years, where, she dies to save her child, basically. Right. But then there's a sort of coda where, we get the sense that, but she was actually there protecting her child all along and things like that. So I think the movie is also kind of conflicted about how to think about motherhood and how to think about mothers. And on the one hand, it sometimes portrays that mother as this sort of self-sacrificing saint, but then it also criticizes her sometimes, or sort of looks at her with a more critical lens. And so I find that portrayal really fascinating, for sure.
Well, and especially you can see that second point of view coming from the daughter who sees her mother, I'm going to go with this other kid instead, right? It's like it's scarring that child. I would imagine there's some reason to maybe look at the mother's choices.
But. Right.
Let's talk about Pulse. This is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's film from 2001. Pulse taps into the anxieties surrounding the internet age and the isolation of modern life. When ghosts begin invading the world through computer screens, a group of young people in Tokyo must confront the bleak reality of a society disconnected by technology. As the line between the living and the dead blurs, the survivors navigate a cityscape that grows increasingly desolate and haunted. Pulse's eerie atmosphere, slow burn pacing, and existential dread create a sense of inescapable doom, reflecting the ennui and alienation of Japan's lost decade. The film's visionary depiction of a world consumed by technology and loneliness continues to resonate with audiences in an increasingly digital age. This film really feels like there's some commentary on modern Japanese society, but it's really just like, I mean, you get a sense of like, we're in the middle of Tokyo, but it just feels like it's a real story of urban loneliness.
Yeah, and the thing I always talk about whenever I show clips from this film or I talk about it is how empty it looks. How you're
always
in this, and I have to say that this is very much the reality of living in Tokyo as well. Like, I think if you've spent time in Tokyo and you spent time in the central parts of it, you're familiar with the intense crowds, and you go to places like Shibuya and Shinjuku. It's just constant people. And yet Tokyo is huge. It's a massive, massive piece of land. And so if you just go a few stations away, you will be in a desert. Like there will be no one on the streets, and you will be surrounded by these massive faceless housing blocks. And you might see a few people, but you'll hardly see anyone. And so I think it's a very realistic depiction in that sense of when we see these people going to these little suburban areas with these huge apartment blocks and there's no one on the street. It's like, yeah, I could imagine that. That could be real. And yet at the end as well, when they're, driving through the more populated parts of the city, it's empty, and parts of it are burning. That's really eerie. And it reminds me of this famous photography book that came out 20 or so years ago called Tokyo Nobody, by this photographer who famously every New Year's Day, I think for like 20 years, he didn't take a holiday. He stayed in Tokyo on New Year's Day, and he got up at like 6 a.m. and he went to like Shibuya Crossing and Tokyo Tower and all these very famous landmarks of Tokyo and took photos of them empty of people. And it is such an eerie book to look at, to flip through these photos and just see these places that if you live here, you know them as just being teeming with people any hour of the day, completely empty. And that's what I always think of when I watch The End of Pulse, is that, this weirdly empty city. And I definitely think that emphasizes this theme in the film of just this feeling that so many urban dwellers have, where you are surrounded by people and yet you feel so lonely and so isolated. And in the end, when you're in your little apartment, you are by yourself and there's no one there except the ghosts.
Right, exactly. Do you feel like this film, I mean, we already talked about how like there's the videotape aspect in Ringu that is kind of some technology, but this film feels different still, even from that. And I'm just wondering if this film kind of started a growing influence of kind of a techno horror within J horror.
Yeah. It's so funny how quickly this film became dated. Just all the little details, like the dial-up internet noise, the floppy disks, and just I will never get over the way that one character says to another, "So, how did you get into the internet?" which today would be like saying, "So, how did you get into drinking water?" Or "How did you get into drinking food?" Or eating food. Sorry. And so, like, just it's 1998, and yet it feels so ancient. And I mean, it's 27 years ago now. Or so it's not 98; it was 2001.
2001,
24 years ago. But it's such a everything was so new, and this was before social media and, these great big boxy clunky computers. We didn't have smartphones. So I do think that, this movie was definitely part of this sort of techno horror boom, which again, I think anytime you have a new omnipresent technology, it's inevitable that you're going to see horror movies about it. So in this case, we were living in a time when gradually more and more people were connected, even if they weren't on their phones 24/7 yet. It made sense that you would see movies about that. I think this movie also points to something really fascinating, which is the fact that people who live outside Japan often imagine it as this tech utopia where all technology is super advanced. Everybody has a talking toilet, and everything is digital.
Yeah.
And the reality is a lot more mixed. So yes, there are talking toilets. There are bullet trains that run very fast, but so much of daily life in Japan is still very analog. There is not free internet in a lot of places. If you go to certain universities, there is no Wi-Fi.
Wow.
And like, it's only recently that we've started to be able to get Wi-Fi on trains. And for so much bureaucratic work, you still have to physically stamp documents, and everything is handled via paper. So many times when I go to a website, if I want to order something or if I want to sign up for something, I fill out this very long form, and then I think, oh, I'm done. And then there's a button that says, please print and fax to this number.
Oh no. Wow.
So there's still so many things that are so very analog. And so that, watching Pulse, I was just like, oh yeah, okay, no, this is about right. That, because I think 2001 in the U.S., I would say this is like Facebook was getting started, and things were maybe moving along at a little more of a clip. But in Japan, you still had the boxy computers and the dial-up internet noises.
Yeah. Although, and even with all of that, though, it still is. It feels very relevant to today, and that's what I find fascinating with the story. Is that Kurosawa crafted a story that taps into, just in general, the nature of technology, and how, again, with just the pervasive nature of what people have access to, and how today there still is this kind of overwhelming loneliness that kind of seems to be throughout society.
Definitely. I think, just the theme of, we're all more connected than ever, but we're all lonelier than ever is definitely resonant today, for sure.
Exactly. Hey, real quick, are you okay on time? We're running a little long. Okay.
No, I'm good. I don't have it. My next thing is at 12, so I have 2.5 hours left. So.
Okay. All right. Well, we won't fill all that time up.
Okay.
Okay. Let's shift gears and talk about Ju-on the Grudge. This is Takashi Shimizu's film from 2002. This is a chilling tale of a cursed house haunted by the vengeful spirits of a murdered mother and son, and the cat. When unsuspecting individuals enter the house, they become trapped in a cycle of terror and death, falling victim to the ghost's relentless rage. Told through a nonlinear narrative that jumps between past and present, Ju-on the Grudge creates a sense of inescapable dread as the curse spreads like a contagion, claiming one life after another. The film's signature pale ghosts, contorted movements, and unnerving sound design have become iconic staples of J-horror. This film explores the ideas of a malevolent force born from extreme human emotions, reflecting the fear of domestic violence and the inescapable nature of trauma. This film really, Ringu kind of established a lot of this stuff. This film seems to kind of solidify a lot of the tropes and conventions that we would be expecting. And I just find it fascinating because it's actually the third film in this franchise.
Yeah. And I think The Grudge in particular is one of those movies where it's so hard to pin down the origin and the chronology of all of it, because you start with this short film, and then you have a direct to video release, and then you have a theatrical release, and then you have some US remakes, and then you have some Japanese sequels, and then you have very recently a Netflix miniseries, and then a 2020 remake reimagining. And so if I'm working with someone who wants to discuss it, I'm always like, okay, well, let's just be clear what we're watching, because it's like, there are a lot of different versions of this. But I think that maybe the theatrical version is the one that a lot of people are most familiar with. But basically the story is the same every time and really it's a haunted house story. And yet a haunted house with a very specific type of haunting, with this, the lingering presence of this woman and her child and the cat, who were violently murdered by this husband. And I think what I really love about both the straight to video and the theatrical version is the nonlinear way that it's
Oh,
told.
absolutely.
Yeah, I just find that really fascinating how we move backward in time to see how all of this began, and so having that knowledge going forward of what's eventually going to happen is just really fascinating. And the house itself is so interesting to me. I think it is an actual house that is located in Nerima, which is a suburb of Tokyo. I actually used to live nearby. I've never seen the house, but
I was going to say, did you?
it was in my old neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it is this what I would call just this very typical aspirational suburban home where I think for a lot of people in Japan, particularly people who live in large cities like Tokyo, a lot of people have this dream that someday they will have a house in the suburbs, because once you have a family, you need a little more space. So you move down the train line to a place with more trees and maybe, closer to a school. And you would have this kind of house that's usually a 2-story house that has a sort of combination of like Japanese style and Western style living. So like the first floor of the house has tatami rooms, with straw mat rooms on the floor. And then the second floor has like beds and wooden floors. There's a little deck area where you can open the sliding doors. There's like a lawn, place to hang your laundry. And so it's, on the one hand, it's a dream house. It's this place that everybody dreams of having eventually, and yet it's a nightmare house. It is a tainted house that is full of bad vibes, and anybody who comes into contact with the house, again, with the chaotic rage, basically it doesn't matter who you are. If you just happen to enter this house, that stain will follow you for the rest of your life, and you won't be able to escape it.
And even to the point where sometimes it's outside of the house. And I find that fascinating, where it's like, because you might live there, perhaps one of these ghosts will follow you to a place where you work or go to school or whatever, and end up attacking somebody who you like. And so that's like a fascinating element of this, is that it doesn't have to, like, I mean, I guess that, and maybe that's kind of a Western way of thinking about it. Like, well, it's the haunted house, right? So the house is where the ghost is and stays. But then you have this idea of like, oh yeah, no, it went over to a different place and took on somebody else over there. And I find that to be an interesting and almost more terrifying element that is included in this.
Yeah, and I think historically, if you're thinking about slasher films or haunted house movies from the U.S., often, the biggest response is just leave the house. What are you doing? Just get out of the house. Right. And now in movies like The Grudge and many other movies, I think a lot of people have started to make the point that, oh no, it doesn't matter. Once you've entered this house, it is stuck to you. And so even if you leave the house, it's no good. And we definitely see that in Ju-on, how the bad vibes stick to you. And so even if you have long since left the house, it doesn't matter. They will come after you still.
Too bad. It'll come after you. It'll come after your kids. It'll come after everyone in your circle. Yeah, it's crazy. This there's also an element of exploring kind of like family dysfunction that we have here, because I mean that's kind of the foundation of this whole curse that you talked about, right? How this husband was felt like his wife was drawn to this other man. She was drawn to this other man. That does exist, but like he takes it very far. He brutally murders her and the kid and the cat, like kind of killing everybody and going kind of crazy, which builds to all of this. And I'm just wondering, like with this sort of family dysfunction, is it also reflecting any broader issues in Japan? Or is, I mean, again, dysfunctional families are everywhere, but I'm just curious if that's an element.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, if I remember correctly, Takashi Shimizu, the director, might have said that he was inspired by like an actual incident, an actual murder, where a husband murdered his wife. But I think it's a highly fictionalized version of that. But I don't think, the rate of like the murder rate in Japan is not high compared with other countries. However, the rate of domestic violence, unfortunately, is, and I think what has often been discussed in academia and in the news is that a lot of it goes unreported. So it can seem that the rates are low, but then if you do some digging, you discover that if you look at police reports and if you look at divorce records and like causes for divorce and stuff, you find that it is actually pretty common. And unfortunately, one thing that has been getting more attention in recent years is that the police are very unhelpful. If you are being abused and you go to the police, they will often be dismissive, or they will say that, oh, this is a domestic issue. This is a private issue, so we're not going to get involved. People have been told, oh, well, you just need to be nicer to your husband. You just need to be more understanding.
Wow. Yeah.
So that it's pretty dark. I think, so that aspect of it certainly would have been familiar to people, this idea of a husband who, was abusive to his wife, maybe not going so far as murder, but being abusive. And I think it's interesting to see how the different versions of the film treat that abuse and eventual murder differently, where I think in the straight to video version and the theatrical version, we get the sense that this woman perhaps had feelings for this other man and maybe she exchanged letters with him, but we don't ever get the sense that she actually had an affair with him.
No,
it doesn't seem to be confirmed. Whereas in later versions of the story, it was kind of disturbing, actually. I think in the Ju-on Origins Netflix story, they kind of shifted it around to make it seem like the wife was a sort of like femme fatale type character who was just sleeping with lots of people, and then she kind of deserved what she got. And it was, I really didn't like it.
Dark shift.
Yeah, it was a very dark shift. And so, but I think this character of Kayako and her son Toshio, the images of these two from Ju-on is such a powerful image of this embodiment of violence, where you have this woman, covered in blood. Usually she's depicted as being, in this dress, and like her face and her body are covered in blood. And she has this creepy death rattle, this kind of sound that she does. That's
you do it quite well.
So frightening to hear. And she's the actress, I think, was a dancer. And so her movement is very carefully considered. She kind of moves like an insect, I would say. When she's coming down the stairs, she moves in this very creepy, inhuman kind of jerky way. And then the son, is always kind of depicted. I think Shimizu has said that he was really thinking about buto, which is this art form with these dancers who paint their faces white and then they open their mouths. It's this black hole in this white space. And so Toshio, is pictured with this white face and this open black mouth, and then, makes this weird meowing sound like the cat. Right. So I think for me, like every time I see them, I just think about violence. I think about violence against women and children, and the way that they embody that act, but they also embody the rage and the pain that is a response to that, where, of course, they couldn't really respond to it in life because they didn't have the power. But by becoming vengeful spirits, now they can take back that power, just like Oiwa from the Ghost Story of Yotsuya. They can take back this power and just kind of fling their rage around to whoever happens to be nearby.
Right. Wow. And they sure do.
Yeah.
Let's jump to Noroi the Curse. This is Koji Shiraishi's 2005 film that it's a recent favorite of mine. I got the box set, and you've got a great little bit on there, which is nice to listen to. This is a found footage horror film that follows a paranormal investigator who documents a series of strange occurrences connected to a deadly curse. As he delves deeper into the mystery, he uncovers a web of supernatural events involving a malevolent entity, a missing child, and an ancient ritual. Presented as a compilation of his investigative footage, interviews, and various show clips, Noroi, the Curse blurs the line between reality and fiction, creating a sense of authenticity that heightens the film's unsettling atmosphere. With its slow burn pacing and creeping dread, the film delivers a unique and deeply unnerving J-horror experience. What I love so much about this, I mean, I'm a fan of found footage. The most recent episode that I had on the show was actually found footage horror films, so it was in my mind already. But we're not necessarily just getting like a found footage film. It's actually like, it feels like you're watching a documentary, that like a TV documentary that he would have put together doing an investigative report. It just happens to be about paranormal stuff. And we're including clips of variety shows. We're including news articles and other elements that we're seeing here, the news. And I find that to be a fascinating way to tell this story that really imbues a sense of kind of reality to it. What effect does it really have, though, like doing a horror film this way, like this particular story, that how does that end up for you, ending up affecting the atmosphere and the kind of the storytelling of the film?
I think, I first saw this film, I guess maybe 10 years ago, and I really loved it too. And I just thought it was a really fresh take on found footage horror. I think what's really fascinating to me about it is the fact that, yes, it's found footage horror film, but the types of media that are included are so different.
Yeah.
Where often with found footage horror, it's just like one perspective, it's one camera that has been following a person or group of people. Whereas here we have this really interesting collection of, one camera person, but also TV news programs and this reporter who is going around trying to collect evidence, kind of stock footage, maybe commercials. So what that really did for me was immediately place it in a very contemporary Japanese context, because those TV shows that we see are very accurate. These are the kinds of TV shows that people watch in the afternoon, in the evening. Yeah. They're often called baraiti bangumi, or variety shows, where you have, they're sometimes like 4 hours long. And in the first hour, you might have a psychic. And then the second hour, you might have people making fried rice. And in the third hour, you might have a pop group that'll come on and sing. So it's just all over the place with different kinds of people. And so just seeing all of that footage side by side was really interesting. And you could imagine, and that immediately brought up the question for me too, of like, who filmed this and why? But in this case, it was more, who edited this? Like who put this together and toward what purpose?
Right.
And we learn that, there's of course some little text at the beginning that basically says this is footage from something that never aired. Right. Because it was too much. You couldn't air. Yeah. So that was really interesting to me to see this just done in a very Japanese context. And Shiraishi is a really interesting director. He has actually said that he does not like this movie, even though I think it's probably his most popular and maybe his most loved movie. He doesn't like it because it's the movie where he had the least control. And so he has made a lot of lower budget films, and also he has a whole series called like Strange and Horrifying Files, Senjutsukaiki File, which are sort of like scary true stories, just like these reenactments of these sort of freaky stories. And in most of his other movies, he plays himself on screen. He writes the script, he does the filming, he does the editing, he does the casting. So he is kind of a control freak. And I think for this film, for whatever reason, he did not have all of that control. I still think it's a really good film, but he personally prefers his other movies that are definitely a little rougher around the edges, I think. In terms of,
I mean, is this earlier in his career? Was he still at a point where he
this was kind of in the middle. So this is 2010, I think. And
2005.
Or it's 2005. Yeah, so it's even further back than that. Wow. And so I think this was his first like, big budget movie. I mean, comparatively big budget movie. Yeah. But then after this, he would go on to make his Strange and Horrifying Files series. He would make Occult. He would make, much later, he would make Sadako versus Kayako, very big budget movie. And that was another one where I think he didn't have much control. But really, I think what he really became known for were these very, very rough around the edges, sometimes honestly kind of hard to watch just because they contain a great deal of violence and scatological humor. These movies that were like Cursed Violent People, A Cult. Cult is another one that were all kind of riffing on the found footage horror theme, but again, where he usually plays himself and other people play versions of themselves. He wrote a book called Fake Documentary Textbook, which is basically just his whole like treatise on making found footage horror movies.
Interesting.
And in that book, he includes a CD, which is basically a video showing him making a short film from beginning to end. And the process takes about 8 hours.
Wow.
Where basically he meets his actors at the train station in the morning. They go to this apartment they've rented. He shows them the draft of the script, and then he finishes the script in real time. And then they shoot it, and then they edit it. And it's like, I think it's like a 15 or 20 minute short film, but and again, the whole process, he has control from the very beginning.
Interesting.
But then I think Noroi, The Curse is just like, it still has so many of his hallmarks in the sense that there's an invented urban legend. So he loves to do that. He loves to, create these demons or legends, that it's like, oh yeah, have you heard of, oh yes, I've heard of this. Like, no, we haven't. It's completely made up. And also he loves to, there's always a lot of Cthulhu-like imagery. He does a lot with like, spirals, kind of making you think of Junji Ito in there, and spirals and loops and funny little masks with big holes in them. And just, he does amazing things with what appears to be a very small budget, where, he doesn't, I think because the nature of found footage horror is such that, the footage is going to be a little grainy and a little off. And that works in his favor because, we can't actually see these monsters clearly. We just see little fuzzy bits of them kind of between the static of this footage. And I find that really effective. I think it's very creepy as an audience member to be watching and be like, wait, where?
Right,
what did I do? And like you have to pause and rewind and see if you actually saw what you saw.
Right. Is this film? It's the approach that he took was. We had been seeing found footage films; they'd been around for a while, but taking this approach, did it end up kind of expanding upon or subverting conventions of J-horror at the time? Did it lead to more of this type of film?
I don't know for sure, but I do think that around this time and after this, we do start to see more fake documentary / found footage elements in J-horror. So even if they're not straight up found footage films, they do have that component in them. So like the Scary Village trilogy, all of those films open with this YouTuber character who is streaming from whatever the scary village of the film is. And we get the sense that was, filmed, and then like that person died, and then that footage, was found on the internet. And then other films as well. I think there's a movie called Toshimaen, Haunted Park, which is about this famous theme park in Tokyo that closed recently. But it opens with people streaming on Nico Nico, which is like the Japanese version of YouTube, or a Japanese version of YouTube. It's not as popular, where text streams across the screen instead of like appearing in a comment section at the bottom.
Oh,
and
interesting.
And some
it's very,
of this,
like very TikTok sort of
exactly,
thing.
It was kind of like a proto TikTok, and then some of the Ring sequels as well featured people streaming on Nico Nico, and also like a haunted YouTube subplot. And so, and very recently, there's a film that I really love called Missing Child Videotape, which is kind of a terrible name. I think they need a different name. And I mean, the Japanese title is Missing Child Videotape. Like they,
they really went all in.
That's the title. But that film as well, it's not a found footage horror film, but it centers around this old piece of family video footage that this child took when he was very young. And so I do think that even if J-horror didn't go full found footage after the 90s and early 2000s, I do think that element has crept into a lot of found footage horror films. Whether that is because of the influence of Shiraishi, I don't know. But we can definitely see it. I would say that Shiraishi is still kind of an outlier. Like he's known, in Japanese horror circles, but he kind of fashions himself a bad boy and an indie guy. And so even though he has made, big budget movies like Sadako versus Kayako and Hell Girl as well, I think which is based on manga. But he has mostly stayed outside of the studio system. And I think he has said, that his real joy and his real passion is his strange and horrifying Files straight to video series,
I see.
Which he makes on his own with total control, and he really enjoys doing that.
Well, hey, I mean, more power to him if he can do it. That's great. Let's dig into The Inerasable. This is Yoshihiro Nakamura's film from 2016. The Inerasable explores the concept of jikobuken. Is that right?
Jikobuken, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Jikobuken, or stigmatized properties where tragic deaths have occurred. When horror novelist Kubo Kihiro receives a letter from a university student about a cursed apartment, she teams up with the student to investigate the property's dark history. As they uncover a series of unsettling revelations, they find themselves confronting a malevolent force that threatens to consume them. The Inerasable offers a slow burn atmospheric tale that delves into the psychological impact of past tragedies and the inescapable nature of fate, reflecting the evolving landscape of J-horror in the 2010s. This, I found this to be such an interesting film because it felt like a little detective movie. We've got these two who decide they're just going to keep solving these mysteries. They solve one, but it gives them clues to a deeper mystery, taking them further back in time. They work on solving that, and it gives them clues that take them even further back in time. And this one property, which is the apartment complex, and then what had been built on the land before that, and then before that, and it just kind of keeps going. And it was such an interesting way to kind of take what you get with something like Ju-on the Grudge, where it's a cursed property, but really it's because of this one murder that had happened there. And now those particular ghosts are going to take it on everyone else. This is an evolution of that, where, that led to something else horrible happening. And because that happened, that led to something else horrible happening. And it was interesting to see the way that they chose to tell the story, where it kind of kept folding in upon itself. And I don't know, I guess, can you tell us more about kind of this jikobuken and just like the nature of this and in this particular story?
Yeah, so jikobuken or stigmatized properties are this concept that exists in Japan of basically properties where some sort of violent death has occurred. And basically this means that these properties, first of all, are cheaper if you want to rent them or purchase them. It also means that if the violent death, whether it was death by suicide, murder, if it happened during the previous tenancy, the real estate agent is required to inform the next tenant that this happened, but they're not required to inform the tenant after that. So this is a kind of a creepy little loophole that you could be living in a jikobuken and you just don't know it because they're not required to tell you. However, I did talk to some people who told me that that would be a really shady thing to do. Any real estate agent worth their salt would not lie about a place being a jikobuken, because that would come back to haunt them, literally. And it would just be bad business. They wouldn't really do that. Sure. These days, jikobuken are actually, there are real estate agencies that specialize in them. And, they rent to students, to people who just want to live someplace cheap. And there was a
very particular market for
there is a market for them, especially in a city like Tokyo where rent is so expensive and moving is so expensive. And in particular, there was an ad that went viral a couple of years ago where basically a particular real estate agency was trying to sort of liven up its Jiko Buken properties, and the little picture of a cartoon ghost, and the ad copy said, "Live alone," without actually living alone. So the idea was, you could live with a
Yeah.
ghost, and it's fun.
Oh, wow.
And so, I think Jiko Buken also, they're sometimes older properties, and maybe they haven't been renovated in a while because people don't want to spend money on these properties that don't rent for very much, or that they can't be purchased for a lot of money. And certainly there are people who are more than happy to live in them if they're cheap. But there is this idea that, they have bad vibes, and they're stigmatized. So certainly I think like businesses would be wary of purchasing a building or an office that would be designated as a Jiko Buken, because then maybe their clients wouldn't want to come there or something.
True. Yeah,
And
right.
I think I had often thought about this when I was, living in really cheap apartments in Tokyo. I was like, oh, would I ever do that? And I remember thinking, well, yeah, I don't care. I'd be fine. But my concern would be friends. Like, would my
Would
friends,
they care?
yeah, would they like never want to come visit me
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something?
Right. So then it becomes your burden to decide, do I tell
Exactly.
people or
Yeah.
not?
Yeah, precisely. And so I think, as you said, in this movie, we get this sort of, Russian doll
That's
situation
a great way
where,
to describe it. Yeah.
yeah, we start with, the bad thing that happened in maybe this apartment, but then, before the apartment there was a house there, and then something bad happened in the house. And so it's this long history of, bad things, kind of similar to Ju-on, where, something happened in this space, this physical space, and it has lingered. And the title of the Japanese title of this movie is basically The Stain. So it's, kind of similar to something that's inerasable, this idea of a stain that sticks to
which is,
you and you can't
yeah,
get rid of.
even brought up in the opening
Mhm.
text for
Mm.
Ju-on,
Yeah,
right? This idea
right.
of a stain.
Mhm.
That's very similar. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other interesting thing, I actually just learned this a little while ago, is that Ju-on is an invented word. It's not a
Yes.
It's not a Japanese
Right.
word. He totally made it up for the film. But Zan-e, the stain, and the full Japanese title is Zan-e sunde wa ikenai heya, which means the stain, the unlivable room.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, yeah, you have this idea of a thing, just a bad vibe that sticks to you and you can't get rid of. And actually, the posters for the film show these women, with these kind of like ink blots on their hands, these
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
stains that they can't wash off. So yeah, this bad stuff happened, and now many, many years later, even though there's a different building, it has lingered. And sadly, as we see in the film, even when our poor young college student moves, it follows her.
Yeah,
And so
right, right.
she's not going to be able to get rid of it. And this poor novelist who has built this gorgeous modern home with her husband, looks
Yeah,
like that
she's
home
stuck
is
too.
tainted too. They're
Yeah,
not going to be able to escape it.
right, right. Yeah, because they talk about like you can solve the problem, we'll just say, but it just births a new one. Is kind of like
Exactly.
the way
Yeah.
they describe that. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a wonderful line where the college student at one point just says, "How far do you want to go?"
Yeah.
And it's the feeling is, solving the mystery might not be a good idea. Like,
Yeah.
maybe we
Right.
don't want to dig too deep because we might not like what we find.
Yeah. Or it just may never end. It just
Yeah.
might be this perpetual thing that's
Right.
like trauma after trauma after trauma. Yeah.
Exactly.
This is really our first time, yours and mine, to talk about these later J horror films. And I'm just wondering, as we're talking about our last film that we're going to be discussing, how does this reflect the evolution of J horror as we're like by now in the 2010s, and then even all the way up through today? I mean, is there are we seeing the evolution of it?
So I think that, unfortunately, a lot of J horror, Japanese horror films that have been released in the last 15 or 20 years are just not very good. They're just not very interesting. They're not very scary. They tend to recycle a lot of the tropes and images from the older films. Sometimes they're sequels or prequels. Sometimes it's the same director making a similar story with just slight variations. So I kind of feel like the genre has not necessarily evolved. It's sort of died,
Yeah, yeah.
with occasional bright spots. There have been a few moments over the last 10 or 15 years where something like the Inerasable has come out. Where I'm like, oh, this is actually pretty good. And but I think that for me, some of the most interesting stuff related to Japanese horror right now is happening on YouTube, where you have these young creators, some of whom are video editors, professional video editors, some of whom have worked in the film and TV industry, who are just making really interesting work outside of the studio system. And one of my favorite examples of this is a channel called Fake Documentary Q, which is just a collection of little found footage horror films. These are people who make movies anywhere from like 7 minutes to 35 minutes in length. And they're self-contained stories that are usually some type of, Shiraishi style mockumentary ghost story. And they're just really good. They're really effective. They're very spooky. I think they're really well done. They're very subtle. So that's one. There's another one called Zozozo, which basically means like shiver, to shiver with dread.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is just a very standard, like we go to haunted spaces or supposedly haunted spaces and bring our camera. So it's kind of a documentary. That one's actually very popular. I think it has a few million followers. And then more recently, one that has become really successful is the Uketsu channel, which got really successful a year or so ago with a video called Strange House, which has this YouTuber character who wears a mask and speaks in an auto-tuned voice, and just kind of with a couple of little photographs and floor plans in the background tells the story of this very strange house. That person is also a novelist, and they have written a couple of books at this point, one called Strange Houses and one called Strange Pictures, which just got an English translation that's very successful, which are also just sort of creepy, interconnected stories about spooky things. And so that honestly is what's most intriguing to me today about sort of Japanese horror trends is this stuff that's happening on YouTube with these young creators making really interesting videos and telling stories about ghosts and spooky things.
That's awesome. I'll have to put some of those links in the show notes so people can check those out. Let's talk about issues with this as far as like things to consider, starting with kind of the cultural specificity and kind of like challenges of translation, if we can say, if there are any. I'm just curious, like, obviously some of these, like especially Ringu, Ju on the Grudge, have had massive success internationally. They've really found audiences and people have latched on to them. And again, that's largely how this whole like people discovered J-horror in the first place. But does some of the specificity within the culture and the way it's explored in the films, does that create challenges for international audiences?
I mean, I think like the English language version of The Ring, I enjoyed that. I thought it was a fun movie. I thought it was very different. Yeah, I thought it was very different from Ring, but on its own, I think it's a fun movie. I do think, though, that with so many of the English language remakes of these films, first of all, a lot of them just aren't very good. They're not very well made, so they're not really effective as horror films. But I do think that moving the films away from Japan and moving them away from that culturally specific and historically specific location, they do lose something. And it's not so much that, these films are Japanese and they're in Japanese and that's what makes them scary. Yeah. But that is a part of it. They are, I mean, every horror film is a product of a specific culture and a specific historical moment. And if you completely separate it from that, it does lose something. It loses its specificity and it loses some of the little details that made it creepy or interesting. And so I think, unfortunately, when these stories are, made and set in the United States, it's possible to make them good, but they do often lose something, and they just lose a flavor. They lose a
Right. Yeah.
specific vibe that they had that was connected to the cultural and historical moment that they came out of.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And even when Shimizu adapted his own film and made The Grudge, it was set in Tokyo, but even still, it didn't feel like it was quite the same.
Yeah.
What about gender representation? Are they representing gender roles and gender dynamics well in J horror films? And horror films often already have a I don't know. I guess we can just say an element of gender that has been a key part of it. Often, whether it's using sexual images in a way to kind of like advance the story or perhaps subvert the story. And then often we started getting like the final girl and all of that sort of thing. But I'm just curious, like what, as far as J horror films go, and we talked a little bit about motherhood and stuff, but I'm curious more about kind of like the dynamics that we're seeing here.
I think one important thing to say about that is that the Japanese film industry has historically been a very hostile place for women, both as actors and as crew members and directors. Sexual harassment is a huge problem. Just abuse, what they call power harassment, just being forced to work very long hours for very little pay is a big problem. Unions are not as powerful in the Japanese film industry, so you just don't have the same protections. In recent years, several filmmakers have gotten together kind of in the wake of the Me Too movement to form organizations that are designed to protect people within the film industry. So change is happening slowly, surely. But percentage-wise, if you look at there are organizations that tally this data. And if you look at films with budgets of over, say, like $10 million that were made in the last 20 years, the percentage of those films that were made by women is like less than 2%.
Jeez, wow.
Really, really tiny. And many women directors have talked about the reality of being a director, being a woman director in Japan. First of all, just the hours. If you are a woman who's also married and has a child, it's just impossible to continue working because the hours are so punishing. You just can't do it. Also, though,
and just to clarify, that's also because of expectations. Like once you get home,
I think it's expected, that you will be at home, caring for your husband and your child, and also just if you're a new mother and you need to breastfeed, for example, that you're not going to be able to do that if you're working 14, 16-hour days.
Sure, yeah.
And a lot of women have also just talked about how men will refuse to work with them. Some men will just not work under a woman director, or they will just be, very hostile to a woman director or any woman who's in charge. And so again, it's changing slowly, but it is very slow to change. And there is, in fact, to my knowledge, there is only one woman who has consistently made horror films in Japan, and that is Mari Asato. And these days, she's actually not really doing horror so much. She's kind of moved into TV and melodrama, and I hope she goes back to horror because I really love her films. But she has talked about just the fact that and she, I think, is kind of similar to a lot of women directors in Japan, where she really doesn't like to talk about this. She doesn't like to talk about, being a woman director. She doesn't want to be seen as a woman director. She just wants to be seen as a director. She doesn't want to get pigeonholed. She doesn't want to get labeled, because as soon as that happens, then, very justifiably, she says, then you're that person or that type of filmmaker and nobody takes you seriously. But she has talked about how, she does feel that she's different. She works differently. She gives more detailed notes. Obviously, she has a very different relationship with actresses than a male director would. And I personally think we can see that in a lot of the performances that she gets from the often young actresses in her films. She made a movie called By Location, which I think famously had an all-female or almost all-female crew, which is really, really rare in Japan. Great, and she's talked about just the importance of having a mixed crew. because she says, like, if you're the only woman on set, it's really hard. And so it needs to be more than one so that, you're not the only one speaking up. So I feel like when it comes to just gender issues in horror, this is the big one in Japan, is just the lack of diversity of voices. The fact that we just do not have many women directors. We do, though, have plenty of women screenwriters and novelists. A lot of, like The Inerasable, for example, was based on a very popular novel written by a woman. And Mari Asato has based a few of her films on popular novels by women. So there is some very interesting writing happening from women, but directing, not so much.
Not so much. Ugh, well, hopefully that will change as they're developing these different things and everything. But well, let's just end our conversation. I want to know, looking into the future, like the evolution of J-horror, given the changing media landscape, given the sense, as you've already said, like that it feels like they're playing on just the tropes and what's expected from previous and better films. Where do you see and how do you see it evolving as we kind of continue?
Where I hope it evolves is that I hope that we continue to see opportunities for young filmmakers to just take risks and do weird things and play around with the genre. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of what we've seen in the last 15 or 20 years has just been very safe and very familiar and comfortable and formulaic, and just kind of, again, recycling a lot of stuff that we've seen before. So what I would really love to see is just people given the space and the opportunity to just really, get messy and to play around with just the idea of what makes you frightened, what scares people in 2025 and beyond. And, whether that happens on YouTube, whether it happens in the indie scene, whether it happens within the studio system, I don't think it's very likely. But I hope that we see those opportunities. And I hope that, we see some more directors like Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who thankfully I think has mentored quite a few people. He mentored Mari Asato. He mentored another really talented young woman called Yui Kiyohara, who's made a couple of movies recently. I hope we continue to see filmmakers like him who really see this as an art. Because I do think that Kiyoshi Kurosawa's films, they're genre films, they're horror films, but they're beautifully made. He is a phenomenally talented director when it comes to, mise en scène and cinematography and editing and sound design. And so I would just love to see more of that very careful kind of filmmaking where, yes, it's spooky and it's scary and it gives you a thrill, but it also, it takes the work seriously and really puts in the effort to make something meaningful.
Couldn't end it on a better note. That's fantastic. Some great comments there. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Do you have any socials where you like to direct people to learn more about you and follow you out there on the interwebs?
Sure. I'm probably most active on Blue Sky, where my handle is News from Nihon, all one word. So that's NEWSFROMNIHON, News from Nihon. I also have a website called eigafile, EIGAFILE.com, where I'm not as active as I should be. I do write reviews there occasionally of just Japanese films and a lot of horror films as well. And you can find all of my CV and other links and things at lindsaynelson.jp. That's my main website.
Fantastic. Well, we will put all of that in the show notes.
Great.